Two brothers classified among India's most sought-after fugitives spent 6 consecutive years constructing an elaborate system of concealment, rotating between cities on a nightly basis, deliberately avoiding any fixed location that law enforcement could track, and systematically altering their physical appearance to the point where recognition became nearly impossible. For 6 years, every investigative effort launched against them produced nothing actionable. Every lead dissolved. Every surveillance operation came up empty. Then, in a pre-dawn raid executed at approximately 3:30 in the morning, officers from the Nagpur crime branch operating in coordination with the Uttar Pradesh Special Task Force breached a rented flat in Nagpur and terminated one of the most determined evasion operations in recent Indian criminal history. The story of how those 6 years began, how they were sustained, and precisely how they ended reveals a criminal conspiracy layered with family connections, calculated identity erasure, forensic misdirection, and a web of organized crime reaching back through a notorious gangster's decades-long reign of violence. On the 9th of November 2016, in the Indian state of Uttar Pradesh, a 22-year-old woman named Priyanka Bardia was murdered with a ferocity that distinguished this case immediately from ordinary criminal violence. Priyanka was employed at a private firm in the Nidau area. On an evening she would not survive, she took a shortcut through an open field while returning home from work. That decision placed her directly in the path of 2 men who had been fixating on her, men whose previous attempts to impose a relationship upon her she had flatly refused. That refusal became the stated justification for what followed. The 2 individuals who intercepted her in that field confronted her again, received another rejection, and responded by killing her. But the manner in which the killing was carried out extended far beyond any act of impulsive rage. Acid was poured onto her face. Her limbs were severed from her body. Her remains were then ignited. The deliberate, methodical nature of the post-mortem mutilation, the dismemberment, the burning, the chemical disfigurement, was not incidental to the crime. It was an operational decision, executed with the specific objective of destroying the body's identifying characteristics so completely that forensic confirmation of the victim's identity would become impossible or severely delayed. The perpetrators understood that an unidentifiable body meant an investigation without a confirmed victim, and an investigation without a confirmed victim was an investigation without direction. 10 individuals were taken into custody in the immediate aftermath of the crime. 8 of them were assessed as direct participants in the killing itself. The remaining 2 were charged with actively assisting in the destruction of evidence following the murder. But as law enforcement processed those 10 arrests, 2 men slipped out of reach entirely. Junaid Ahmed, aged 28 at the time of the killing, and Parvez Ahmed, aged 26, vanished from the investigative record with a completeness that would frustrate the Uttar Pradesh police for half a decade. Every effort to locate them failed. Every intelligence lead expired without producing a physical location. The UP police escalated their public commitment to capturing the pair by announcing a reward of 50,000 rupees for information leading to the arrest of each brother, a total bounty of 100,000 rupees, and still, for 5 further years following those initial arrests, neither Junaid nor Parvez surfaced in any actionable form. They had constructed their disappearance with sufficient thoroughness to outlast the initial intensity of the manhunt and settle into a prolonged state of organized fugitive existence. What that existence actually looked like was revealed only after the arrests occurred. During interrogation, Junaid Ahmed confirmed that he and Parvez had been moving between cities on a nightly schedule for the entirety of those 6 years, never establishing residency in one location long enough to generate a traceable pattern. To supplement the geographic mobility, both men had undergone significant physical modification. Authorities stated that the brothers had obtained plastic surgery, a surgical alteration of their facial features so thorough that even their own parents were subsequently unable to identify them from photographic lineups. Combined with changed clothing styles and deliberately grown hair worn long across the face, the 2 men had effectively retired their original appearances. When police ultimately raided the Nagpur flat, the brothers opened the door themselves, operating under the assumption that the individuals knocking at 3:30 in the morning were not law enforcement. The officers had arrived in plain clothes. The moment they identified themselves as police, both men attempted to run. They were apprehended before reaching any exit. A search of the premises uncovered falsified identity documents, weapons, 2 motorcycles, multiple mobile phones, laptop computers, a significant quantity of cash, and a handwritten diary. The diary's contents documented the brothers' criminal activities during the 6 years they spent evading capture, activities that included extortion and armed robbery, with women identified as their primary targets throughout that period. The question of why the brothers were carrying a substantial cash reserve at the time of their arrest was addressed by Additional Superintendent of Police Raja Sharma, who stated that Junaid and Parvez had traveled to Nagpur specifically to execute an extortion operation. They had identified a set of high-profile individuals in the city whom they intended to blackmail, and the cash they carried represented operational funding for that scheme. The question of how the police confirmed the identities of two men whose faces had been surgically altered beyond recognition by their own parents requires a separate and forensically precise accounting. The breakthrough did not originate from biometric identification or photographic comparison. It originated from a water bottle. During the search of the flat, investigators recovered a water bottle bearing a sticker from a Hanuman temple located in Haryana. That sticker connected the bottle to a specific geographic region, and investigators immediately contacted Haryana police to trace the purchase. Records identified the buyer as an individual named Mohammed Asif, who had acquired the bottle from a shop located near his residence. A targeted search operation was launched to locate Mohammed Asif. Simultaneously, investigators pulled the call detail records associated with members of Priyanka Bardia's family. One telephone number appeared with enough regularity across those records to constitute a pattern, and that number belonged to Junaid Ahmed, the primary accused. Two active leads had now converged on Haryana, and a joint team was dispatched to the state. Officers found both Mohammed Asif and Junaid Ahmed at the same location. The discovery that these two men knew each other was the entry point into the conspiracy's actual architecture. Under interrogation, Mohammed Asif disclosed the full relational structure. Junaid Ahmed was his maternal uncle, and Parvez Ahmed was his cousin. He then disclosed something of considerably greater significance. Mohammed Asif was not a peripheral figure in the case. He was its architect. The man whose purchase of a water bottle had given investigators their first viable geographic lead was the individual who had conceived and orchestrated the murder of Priyanka Bardia from the beginning. The mechanism by which Asif had avoided criminal accountability until this point was almost precisely the mechanism that had protected the two brothers. Following the initial wave of arrests, police had in fact detained Mohammed Asif. But because he had already altered his appearance before that detention, Priyanka's family failed to identify him during the recognition process, and he was released. He then relocated to Haryana, where he understood himself to be relatively insulated. His reason for relocating rather than remaining was specific. He had placed a series of phone calls in the period immediately preceding the murder, calls that could be forensically traced to him and would directly link him to the planning of the crime if investigators recovered the records and identified the number. The motive driving Asif's involvement in the killing was a personal obsession that had turned violent upon encountering refusal. He had developed fixation on Priyanka Bardia. She had rejected his approaches. That rejection produced in him not acceptance but a determination to eliminate her. Asif contacted his maternal uncle, Junaid Ahmed, communicated his intention, and provided Junaid with all relevant details. Junaid brought his son Parvez into the operation. Together, the two men carried out the killing of Priyanka Bardia in the manner already documented: the acid, the dismemberment, the burning, and then the three individuals collectively erased whatever evidence they could access before dispersing. Asif's specific motivation for concealment in the period following the arrests extended beyond his own exposure. Several of the 8 individuals arrested in the initial sweep were close relatives of his. He calculated, correctly as it turned out, that once those relatives were in custody and subjected to interrogation, they would disclose information implicating him. That calculation drove him into hiding. Throughout the 6 years that Junaid and Parvez remained fugitives, Asif maintained regular communication with his uncle. The two sides of this divided criminal network met periodically, and when Junaid and Parvez were running low on funds, Asif provided them with cash. That financial support was the operational mechanism sustaining the brothers' evasion. It kept them mobile, kept them fed, and reduced the necessity of remaining stationary long enough to generate a traceable presence. The question of why the brothers ultimately ended their evasion rather than continuing it indefinitely was answered during interrogation. Janide stated that both men had exhausted the financial resources they had accumulated over the course of the 6-year flight. With ASF's supplementary payments no longer sufficient and their own savings depleted, sustaining the logistics of constant relocation had become functionally impossible. Exhaustion and financial collapse, rather than any investigative breakthrough on the part of law enforcement, were what brought the brothers to a position where arrest became the only remaining outcome. When officers arrived at the Nagba flat, the brothers initially refused to submit to custody and demanded to surrender directly before a judicial court rather than to the arresting officers. Police persuaded them to comply with the standard arrest procedure. Following their formal processing, the brothers were scheduled for a media presentation before being transported to Lucknow for further legal proceedings. The criminal lineage behind Janide and Parvez Ahmed adds a dimension to this case that extends far beyond a single act of violence. Reports indicated that the two brothers were the sons of Mukhtar Ansari, a figure with one of the most extensive criminal records in regional organized crime history, approximately 100 documented cases spanning murder, extortion, kidnapping, and land seizure. Mukhtar Ansari was killed in an encounter in 2020. Following his death, Janide and Parvez moved to inherit and operate the criminal infrastructure their father had constructed over decades. The reach of that inherited influence was substantial enough that Janide and Parvez had at various points issued direct threats against the judge and the public prosecutor assigned to the case against them. That institutional intimidation is identified as a primary factor in the brothers' ability to remain uncaptured for such an extended duration. The family's regional power projection had effectively insulated them from prosecution for years, and it was only after Mukhtar Ansari's death eliminated that protective apparatus that the brothers' operational capacity began to deteriorate. They miscalculated the degree to which their own abilities, stripped of their father's network and reputation, could substitute for the cover that network had historically provided. Priyanka Bhatia's mother, when contacted by media following the arrests, delivered a statement that captured two simultaneous and contradictory emotional states. She expressed relief that the men responsible for killing her daughter had finally been detained. She expressed fury that it had taken 6 years for the state to accomplish that detention, 6 years during which, from her perspective, the government had failed to demonstrate any meaningful commitment to pursuing the individuals who had murdered a 22-year-old woman on her way home from work. Her question, directed at the government and demanding an accounting of what actions had actually been taken during those 6 years, was not rhetorical. It reflected a documented pattern of institutional failure compounded by the criminally organized intimidation that the Ahmed family had deployed against the judiciary and prosecution handling the case. The arrest of Janide and Parvez was framed by police as a functioning of the justice system, and in a narrow sense it was. But the 6-year gap between the crime and the capture carries its own weight of accountability that the arrests alone do not resolve. The strategic purpose behind the extreme mutilation of Priyanka Bhatia's body, the acid, the severing of limbs, the incineration, was identified during the investigation as a deliberate effort to prevent physical identification of the remains. The perpetrators calculated that a body reduced to an unrecognizable state would dramatically complicate or potentially prevent the establishment of a confirmed victim identity, and without a confirmed victim, the investigative chain linking them to the crime would lose a foundational link. That calculation underestimated both the determination of the victim's family to pursue identification and the eventual forensic and telephonic evidence trails that investigators were able to reconstruct. The water bottle sticker, the call detail records, the diary recovered from the Nagba flat, and the interrogation of Mohammed Asf collectively assembled a case that the surgery, the relocation strategy, and the false identities had been constructed to prevent. Mohammed Asf remained at large at the point of the brothers' arrests, with active search operations underway across multiple jurisdictions. A dedicated court was designated to handle the prosecution of Janide and Parvez, with bail categorically excluded as a legal option for either defendant. The Uttar Pradesh state government formally committed to pursuing the case through to a final judicial resolution. The question of whether the brothers would ultimately face capital punishment remained open to the judicial process. What was not open was the question of whether they would be released back into the general population. That outcome had been foreclosed by the nature and volume of the charges against them, by the political commitment of state authorities to a public prosecution, and by the evidentiary record assembled across 6 years of fugitive existence, a record that the brothers themselves had inadvertently contributed to by maintaining a handwritten diary of their crimes throughout their time on the run.